Okay, now we'll go to Representative Proctor, District 41, Leavenworth, and he's kind of the man behind this bill. Welcome.
For either better or worse, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members, for taking the time to consider this bill. So I do serve the people of Leavenworth. We came to Leavenworth in 2006, and I'm an historian. So, if you've ever gotten a chance to come to Leavenworth, it's like walking through history. It's the first city of Kansas. It's like the downtown is frozen in time in 1890. It's really a neat place. We're business owners, and we also revitalize houses and commercial properties to get them back into use there. And the genesis of this bill is really that our downtown in Leavenworth, just like a lot of smaller towns, smaller historic downtowns, is dying. Too many of the buildings, a tenant leaves, the building falls out of service, and these older buildings deteriorate very rapidly. So we're really on a clock. We're really on a clock to get these buildings back into service and get businesses back in them before we lose our historic downtowns forever. The name of this bill is the Historic Kansas Act for exactly that reason. So to explain kind of what this bill does, I'll tell you a short story of a development I was trying to do in Leavenworth. Me and my wife own a restaurant in Leavenworth. We wanted to open a second restaurant. And so we got a hold of a property. It was 1889-ish. And it had been a restaurant before, but it had been out of service for about 10 years, and it needed a lot of work. So we went about doing the current historic tax credit program, which gets you a 25% tax credit. The paperwork required to do it is pretty intensive, and you have to get your property approved by the Kansas Historic Society, and they're great folks and they work with you, but if you're already a business owner and you're already doing a bunch of other developments, you really got to go get somebody to do the paperwork for you. And when we went to get somebody to do the paperwork for us, we quickly discovered that the amount of money it was going to take to do the paperwork was going to be as much or more than it was going to take to that we were going to get back in a tax credit. And so that's really the genesis of this, is creating either additional incentives for the current historic tax program or an alternative smaller tax credit to get more of these smaller projects that don't get as much attention done. For the current historic tax credit, this bill creates additional incentives if you're working in a smaller town. If your town is 50,000 or less, which is about Manhattan or smaller, the tax credit goes from 25% to 30% to make it a little more feasible to go after that tax credit. If your town is 9,500 or less, the tax credit goes up to 40%, so we can get some investment in these smaller downtowns in the more rural cities. If it still doesn't make economic sense, or if your building is not in an historic district, right? Because a lot of our downtowns, nobody's gone through the process of actually registering the downtown as an historic district or making sure their business or their building is a contributing property. They're not qualified at all for the current historic tax credit program. That's kind of another situation for this alternative tax credit. And the alternative tax credit is 10%. If the building, the house, the barn that you're trying to restore is 50 years or older, you can take the 10% tax credit. All you got to do is when you file your taxes, you deduct the expenses for the restoration. There's no filing paperwork. There's no pre-approval. There's none of the stuff that you have to go through to get the more lucrative current tax credit. Another problem that we have in our downtown, I'm sure a lot of folks that live in rural areas have the same issue, is folks will restore the downstairs of the old building because they can get a business in there, but it's so expensive to meet the codes in your city to get the upstairs qualified for loft apartments that the upstairs just go unoccupied and are unused in our downtowns. If we can get more people living in our downtowns, we'll get more people shopping in our downtowns and frequenting those businesses, which will create additional economic incentives to get businesses and get buildings restored in those downtowns. So something this bill does is it creates an additional 10% tax credit if you put fire suppression systems in your building, which is usually the expensive hurdle that prevents people from doing those upstairs loft apartments. The final thing that this bill does is it creates incentives for our community banks to invest in these properties. Going back to that building that I was trying to restore to do a restaurant, you know, we had a sewer line that went from the building to the main that was busted. We didn't know that when we got the building, all the way from the building to the main, and the main was 25 foot down. So my $200,000 project turned into a $300,000 project, and when I had to go back to the bank and explain that to them, they were none too happy. And that's something that frequently happens with these projects, which is why community banks don't like to invest money to restoration of old buildings, especially these smaller projects that aren't getting that lucrative tax credit that can be sold in advance, or the 10% can too, but it's much less likely. So this bill creates some incentives for banks to invest to these projects by allowing them to deduct some of the interest. And so with that, I will stand for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any questions for Representative Proctor? Under the historic tax credit program as it is now, and since this is limited to historic areas or historic building, would it be the same that if you're going to go in and rehab for the historic tax credits, the building, that you'd have to conform to kind of the history of the building? You wouldn't take a historic building and go in and fix it up and paint it purple?
Yes, sir. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. For the I think it's section 1 in this, or section 2 in this bill, that current historic tax credit, for which we increased the incentives to 30 and to 40 for different sized municipalities, they still have to go through the process with the Historical Society as they apply to confirm that they're not changing the historic nature of the building as they do the restoration. For the 10%, they're not off the hook either, right? Because to get the building permit, to get permission to begin the project, you have to go to your municipality. And, you know, I don't know how your town might be, but in my town, if you want to build or you want to revitalize in the historic district, even if you're not taking the tax credit, you have to satisfy the historic committee in my town that you're not, you know, painting your building purple or putting neon signs all over it. So this really leaves home rule intact and leaves it in the hands of the municipalities to make sure that we're not inadvertently destroying the historic character of our downtowns as we're trying to revitalize them.
When you're figuring out how much your tax credit is, I know under the current program, you have to, some things are eligible, some things aren't, and you have to go in and calculate the work that you did, how much of it was an eligible improvement and how much not. Is that the same here? And then if it is, who does that? The building?
Again, for the Section 2 tax credits, that current process still is intact, where you have to, it's a negotiation or a discussion with the Historic Society. And the other thing I'd mention is that on bigger projects, when your tax credits are up there towards the $1 million range, the KDOR gets involved and also does a review. But for this 10%, that process, it's any expense on revitalizing or rehabbing or maintaining that building is, you just deduct it on your taxes. There's no, item by item negotiation to say, is that qualified or is that not qualified, which is another reason I wanted to do this, give that alternative to get some of those projects going that wouldn't happen if they had to go through that negotiation.
So that one would be just between you, the accountant, or your accountant or you and the tax people then, to whether
yes, sir.
You did it right.
Yep. And the only way that examination happened is if you got audited, you'd have to prove that that's what the expenses were actually for in a normal audit process. But if you didn't get audited, it would just be, filling out the appropriate lines on your tax form.
Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing the bill. Great bill. So I think in the rural areas where I live, one of the things we might want to do to help hone this down a little bit is to to not include single-unit housing, single-family housing, individual houses, try to keep it more in that historic district, because we do have some single-family houses in some of those districts.
Yes, sir. And I figured I'd ask for the world, and if I got New Jersey, I'd be happy. I honestly just was trying to, no offense to anybody from New Jersey. I figured I would put everything that I thought, we could possibly do to restore the historic character of our state in the bill, and then the committee would deliberate and decide, what was fiscally responsible.
Thank you.